Victory in the sea lanes. The U.S. Merchant Marine in World War II. More than 16 million Americans were in the armed forces during World War II. A quarter of 1 million men served in the American Merchant Marine. On the massive scale of the war, 1 out of 64 may not seem significant, but we who served in the Merchant Marine were the crews of the Liberty ships and tankers that played a crucial role in winning the war. We operated the ships that delivered supplies to the war fronts, often under deadly attack. Through dangerous seas, we transported the armies and the mountains of supplies and equipment that won the war. There were 11 million veterans from the U.S. Army, 4 million from the Navy, about 700,000 Marines, and 241,000 from the Coast Guard. All have been recognized and honored since the 1940s, but dedicated and often battle-scarred Merchant Marine volunteers had to wait until 1988 to be acknowledged as veterans. World War II was an important part of our lives. It was an experience we shared with our fellow veterans, and we take comfort that our unique contribution has been recognized. Some of the old hands were fighting the war from the very beginning, but most of us had to undergo intensive training. The training and the tensions of war are long behind us. Age and infirmity are now taking their toll. American Merchant Marine veterans in New Jersey belong to the Dennis A. Rowland chapter. The chapter is named in honor of Dennis Rowland, a ship's officer who was a prisoner of the Japanese for most of World War II. He endured brutal conditions at the infamous bridge on the River Kwai, but he survived and even came to forgive his torturers. We also survived and have learned to live in a world that changes every day. Many of us travel to Port Newark each month for a meeting at the Seamen's Church Institute. Here we meet with old friends and discuss the issues that are important to us. But we are not alone. Armed Guard veterans who served with us on merchant ships join in the meeting, as do other Navy veterans who were with us in the war zones. In the building's cafeteria, the session opens with a vivid reminder of how age is taking its toll. Chapter Commander Hank Kaminsky reads the roll of mariners who have recently died. The business of the meeting then moves on, but the memories remain, and the sense of obligation is reinforced. There is discussion of laws and government policies by our national commander Frank Dooley and George Searle, who was our national president for 5 years. Talk often turns to the public awareness of the Merchant Marine, past, present, and future, of monuments and ceremonies, of parades and gatherings. The proceedings seem routine and casual, but a pleasant expression sometimes masks a painful memory. George Goldman, now living in Teaneck, remembers watching from a lifeboat in 1942 as his tanker, the Patrick J. Hurley, burned and exploded. The U-boat attack was only 3 months after he had signed on to go to sea. He recalls that his pay stopped when the ship sank, but sadly he is haunted by the sounds of the lifebelt whistles of survivors in the water who could not be found in the dark. 18 men from the crew and armed guard died in that sinking. George joined the war effort at sea because of a taste for adventure and youthful sense of invulnerability. Others were part of a long tradition of seafaring. Axel Monk recalls 1940, when Denmark fell to the Nazis, and he was a 15-year-old cadet on a Danish tanker. The crew demanded that the ship return to the United States to join the Allies. Axel became a ship captain and sailed all through the war. He never lost a ship, but 7 ships were sunk after he had left them. The ancient love of sailors for a good yarn is often manifested after the meeting. Member Morris Roth likes to tell his story. In March of 1945, Morris, now of Clark, was a lookout on the Liberty ship Robert L. Van, leaving Antwerp when the ship hit a mine. There was a loud crash, and he went flying into the air. 60 years later, he still remembers the impact as he came down and hit the deck. The mine sank the ship, but its masts were still above water until the wreck was removed after the war. Incidentally, the van was one of 18 Liberties named after African Americans. Pennsylvania resident Art McMahon tells about loading an anti-aircraft gun during a 1944 attack on his convoy in the Mediterranean. The planes flew low between the ships, and they had to take care not to hit other ships. He was only 16 years old at the time. Howard Morseburg, now a resident of California, was a young purser in convoy in the Mediterranean on April 20th, 1944. A German torpedo bomber scored a hit on the SS Paul Hamilton, which was loaded with ammunition. The ship erupted in a massive explosion that wiped out the lives of 580 men, including the merchant crew of 47, the 29 armed guard, and the 504 men of the Army Air Force. The Paul Hamilton, with all the men aboard her, simply vanished from the surface of the sea, from the face of the earth. This disaster was not made public until after the war. Earlier, in September of 1943, Bill Pearson of Summit, New Jersey, was assigned to the Navy Armed Guard on the Liberty ship Dunham Wright. He remembers watching as the cargo was loaded in California. 55-gallon drums of aviation fuel were lowered into the deep hold. Bombs were then stacked above the drums. When the holds were filled, the ship sailed into the Pacific for its lonely voyage into danger. The cargo was safely delivered to the Air Corps and Navy bases in the war zone. In Leyte Gulf, during the liberation of the Philippines, 2 ships loaded in just this way were blown up by enemy planes. Another ammunition ship disappeared in the Indian Ocean, leaving only bits of wreckage that drifted ashore a year later. During the war, 37 merchant ships vanished without a trace and with no survivors. Danger even followed our ships and crews into port. In Bari, Italy, on December 2, 1943, the ammunition ship John Harvey was hit by German bombers. It disappeared in a massive explosion. 17 other ships were sunk, and much of the city was destroyed. On July 17, 1944, 2 merchant ships were blown to bits in an accidental explosion in Port Chicago, California. The blast caused damage 50 miles away in San Francisco. Merchant Marine casualties in these incidents, and even in the war zones, were often not carefully tabulated. During the war, the trials and achievements of the Merchant Marine were veiled in secrecy to keep the enemy in ignorance. After the war, the records were stored away, and many were lost. Historians and researchers have difficulty in finding details and accurate accounts of the monumental effort that made it possible for the Allies to win World War II. We who lived the experience all those years ago are anxious to lift the curtains of forgetfulness and neglect. We are anxious to tell our story. We sailed the seas that erupted in the explosion of torpedoes and mines. We searched the skies for enemy planes that strafed our decks and crashed into our ships. We participated in the dangerous convoys that reached to the distant battlefields through icy Arctic seas and the shark-infested waters of the South Pacific. We lived and stood watch on top cargoes of millions of gallons of high-test fuel and volatile ammunition. Our hastily built ships were sometimes torn apart by terrible storms, and ships often disappeared without a trace. We witnessed the explosions and sinkings that took the lives of other merchant seamen. But eventually, we, the fortunate ones, returned to port and found our way home and to productive post-war careers. Ours is a history that is worth telling. The Merchant Marine continues to serve our country, and we are active in promoting its role in commerce and defense.